Friends, we're going to ask you all now, if you haven't muted yourselves, to please mute yourselves. That'll be so much help for us.
So I'm supposed to mute my phone. She said, mute your phone. Mute it. Looks like a new series. You want to try it? Mute your phone.
Okay. I think I'm just checking really quickly. It's going to be really helpful for everybody to mute so we can minimize background noise and feedback and all of those things. So if you all would not mind muting, I would sure appreciate that.
Margaret Fish left. Do you think that's who?
Give it about another minute. Make sure everybody is on.
Who is the host of the call?
Andy Andrews is.
It might be easiest for Andy to mute everyone and then you unmute yourself so that, because I think lots of folks are turning their cameras off instead of muting. From what I see.
Thank you for this Zoom wisdom. I will do that.
Yeah.
All right, everybody's gonna be muted, and then we're gonna.
Okay, wonderful. And friends, we are so glad that you're all here. So I'm getting some feedback, so someone's not muted. So glad that you're all here. So glad that you're all interested in taking up this topic of what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God, and how it is that God engages and uses us in all kinds of ways with the particular gifts that God is sharing with us. So I'd like to start this time with prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Holy Creator God, we are so grateful that you have given us life and breath, and that you call us to the work that you would have us do in this world. Continue to strengthen us, help us learn from our holy scriptures, help us grow more closely with you each day. Help us understand more and more each day how we are called to serve and how we are called to love you and to love one another. Strengthen us, protect us, fill us with your goodness and grace and mercy, and help us reflect your love into the world. We ask all these things in your holy name. Amen.
Amen.
I want to begin by just thanking you all for taking part in this. I love the book of Genesis. People often look at me and wonder what on earth is wrong with somebody who loves the book of Genesis. But I absolutely love the book of Genesis, because what the book of Genesis gives us that we don't see all the time in other places in our scripture are those human interest stories. We get to see raw and real what God's people are and how it is that we engage with one another in the book of Genesis in a way that we don't get to see that anywhere else. And so I'm really grateful for that for a couple of reasons. One, because it clearly tells us that humankind really hasn't changed a whole lot since the beginning of time. We are who we are. And we have moments that are not our best moments. We have some moments that are absolutely wonderful and incredible moments, but we have some moments that are not our best moments. And Genesis shows us that that has been a true statement for us since the beginning of time, that we have some moments that are not necessarily our best. So we're going to kind of start at that very beginning, if you will, to talk about creation and talk about humankind being made in the image and likeness of God, and what we see revealed to us in the book of Genesis very early on about what that actually means. I will encourage you, if you have questions, to put them in the chat. Andy and I are both going to try to have some, keep an eye on the chat so that we can be responsive to questions as we go. Just type your questions in the chat. We're going to save some time for some questions at the end, if we can. We're going to save some time for some questions at the end, so that we can try to be able to engage everything that folks might want to discuss about these first readings in the book of Genesis. And so we're going to actually go to creation, and we're going to go to Genesis 1. Andy, I think you've got some slides.
Yes.
Here you go. Great. Can everybody
Okay.
see those? Yeah, good.
All right. I want to start out by reminding us of a couple of things. One is, of course, there are two different creation stories in the book of Genesis. Genesis 1 has a very different creation story than we see in Genesis 2. And that just reminds us that we have different voices that are helping us to understand the nature of God. I'm not trying to compare the two creation stories in any way, shape, or form, because I don't think that's up to me to compare them. But we have to note that they are very different. For the purposes of this conversation today, we're going to be talking about the first creation story, the Genesis 1 creation story. At the church that I served in Tennessee, I was chaplain of our preschool. And this was a really wonderful way to talk to children about creation, because it is an orderly creation story, and shows that everything that was being created in a way that built on the things that were going to be necessary and compatible for life. This is important for us as we begin to talk about humankind, that humankind couldn't exist in a vacuum. So for each of the days of creation, we see that things that are required for our existence are being created in an orderly fashion. The very first thing God does is create light, because we know that we have to have light in order for there to be vegetation. I mean, in order for us to get to a point where we have vegetation, there has to be something that is not darkness. And so we have God creating light on that very first day. On that second day, we have God separating out the sky from the waters, so that there's layers of life and ways for life to be formed. On that third day, we get some dry land, so that all the waters are kind of gathered together. There's dry land, because again, we can't have that vegetation, which we also see on this third day, the plants, the trees, all of the things that are necessary for our food. We're not going to be able to see those things until we have light and water and land for those things to actually feed and nourish us. And then we're going to get to that fourth day. And that fourth day, we're going to actually see the two lights, the sunlight, the moonlight for night, and this way that we understand the earth to be a rotating thing, so that we have seasons. so that things will grow as they're intended to grow during seasons. And then we're going to move on to that fifth day. And this is where it starts getting really important for us. And Andy, I honestly don't know which slide that is that gets to the fifth day. We're
Yeah.
there. Okay.
Yeah, we're on it. We're on it.
Okay. Now we're starting to see living creatures inhabiting the earth. There's going to be birds flying and fish swimming and all kinds of other creatures that are going to inhabit the earth. And I think there's something important that we have to talk about for a moment as we see that these other creatures that will be sharing this earth with humankind are coming along. We have lots of plants and vegetation that are supposed to be feeding us all, but we're not told in these scriptures that we necessarily would be consuming the living creatures that are upon the earth as well. I just think that's worth noting, that that's not something that we're told. We're told that humankind will ultimately have dominion over those things, but we're not necessarily told that we'll consume them. And that's a little bit different, and I think that's worthy of us understanding. But everything that is necessary for life in the first creation story is created before we get to humankind. Everything that's necessary for life, everything that's compatible with life. And then we get to the creation of humankind. And I want us to just take some time to look at the text from verses 26 through whatever that is, 30, and just see what God says about the creation of humankind. Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. So God creates a world that is ready for humankind, then creates humankind to be part of this world that God has created. And God thought it was very good, very good. Now we're going to learn some things, obviously, about humankind, because we know after God gets done with humankind, what does God do? God rests. Because now we've kind of created the world, and humankind is in the world, and God says, now it is time. I have finished the work and I'm going to rest. And of course, we see in Genesis 2, or the very beginning of Genesis 2, that God says that God has blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on that day, God rested from all the work that God had done in creation. So we know that if you want to look at the first creation story in that way, God saved the humankind for last. That was kind of the capstone, if you will, of all of creation. And we're going to talk about what it means to be created in the image and likeness of God. Because if being created in the image and likeness of God includes male and female, ultimately it's going to include all kinds of ethnicities and races that exist on the earth. What it says to me is that our conceptions around God that largely have come to us from artists, artists who have depicted God in our image and likeness rather than an unimaginable God. Because I kind of think God must be unimaginable for me. I can't imagine the being that is God that could give rise to all the forms of humankind that have derived from being made in the image and likeness of God. So it must be kind of unimaginable, beyond my comprehension, what God must, if I could see God, actually look like. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay for me not to be able to conceive of what it is that God might look like. It's okay. But it's okay to know that there are things about us as human that God valued is so much of God's self that God wanted to create beings in God's own image and likeness. That God puts a lot of value on what it is that humankind will be able to do on this earth that God has created. For God to want to create humankind in God's image and likeness. And so what does that mean? And throughout the book of Genesis, I think we get some glimpses into that I want to take a few minutes to kind of summarize. One thing is to say that we have the capacity for an enormous amount of good, right? We have the capacity to do all kinds of amazing things. We have all kinds of amazing gifts. So we are created with capacity for tremendous good, tremendous love, tremendous care for this earth. We're created with the capacity for all of those things. We see pretty early in scripture too that we're also created with the capacity, that creative germ, if you will, that's in us, also gives us the capacity for doing some things that are not so amazing and wonderful. Of course, and I did not include in our text for today, but it was certainly worthy of a whole lot of conversation about Adam and Eve being left to tend this amazing garden earth, and being told that one tree over there, don't go eat from that tree. That's the one thing I'm going to ask you to do, is don't go eat from that tree. I've often said that, people always ask about that question. If we could ask a burning question of God at some point in time, what would our burning question be? And my burning question would be, why did you give us self-will? Because self-will is great we're creative. We're so wonderfully creative, and we can do so many things with that self-will. But mercy, mercy, we can also do a lot of things with that self-will that can create a lot of havoc and harm. And so Adam and Eve, of course, make a decision that they're going to eat from a tree, one tree. They've got lots of trees to choose from, lots of plants to choose from, lots of food to choose from, and they choose the one tree with, some help from a serpent. Yeah. They choose the one tree that God has asked them, don't choose that tree. Don't choose that one. And that speaks to me also about some of the things that we understand about ourselves as humans, because sometimes when what is presented to us is an opportunity to be obedient, sometimes we take that opportunity and we kind of squander it. We don't do the things that God would have us do in that moment, because that self-will that we have helps encourage us to make decisions that are not necessarily in our best interest for our relationship with God, and also are not in our best interest for our relationship with one another. And of course, this is long before we will have commandments to tell us those things. This is long before. But in theory, if we'd never had self-will, we might not have needed those commandments, right? I mean, we might have just done the things that God had asked us to do, cared for the world in the way that God asked us to care for the world, not eaten from the one tree, but we ate from the one tree that gave knowledge and a range of knowledge that sometimes I think might not be as helpful as we think that it is. But God's will is for us to have that bank of knowledge and to be able to make all kinds of decisions with that knowledge. And of course, we see in the world in which we live all the things that we can do with the knowledge that we're given, because it's plenty. We can do so many things with the knowledge that we're given. We can cure diseases with the knowledge that we're given. The flip side of that is that some of the diseases that we may have may be because of our own disobedience. It may not necessarily have been God's intention that some of the things that we experience in this life are the things that we experience, but then we're given the ability as humans to come up with cures for diseases and for all kinds of ways that we can support one another in the journey when we use our resources that are given to us in very healthy ways. So that first major sin, that first act of disobedience, if you will, of deciding we're going to go consume what we've been told not to consume and to do what we've been asked not to do, kind of sets the stage for what we are going to see as we go through the book of Genesis, as we don't always do those things that we should do. And we get to see it early on. But I really want to focus more, Andy, if you'll go to the next slide. This is where I want to spend some time and focus. Because again, we're still early in the book of Genesis. We're only at chapter 4, and we're experiencing the first murder. Like we haven't gotten very far in the story of these first humans when we encounter the first murder. And we have Adam and Eve who, have wisdom that they aren't necessarily supposed to have, realize that they were naked, realize that they'd done all kinds of things and have covered themselves up and hidden from God, and have brought upon themselves consequences, because we also don't want to talk about the consequences that we suffer when we make decisions that are not the decisions that God would have us make. In Adam and Eve's case, yeah, there's consequences to making the decision to go out and to eat of that tree that they're not supposed to eat. And there's going to be consequences for this son of theirs for the decision that he is about to make. So we're told that Adam and Eve have two sons in here in Genesis 4. Cain is their first son, and second son is Abel. We understand quickly here that these two brothers are given some very distinct gifts, which tells us a lot about humankind, right? We were all given very distinct gifts. In theory, if we're working together with these very distinct gifts, very positive, wonderful things can come of that. So if you have one keeper of the sheep and one tiller of the ground, that should be a really positive thing because they should be able to work together, collaborate, take care of their family in a very wonderful way because they are both given particular gifts. But what actually seems to happen is that some jealousy arises in this relationship. So Abel has kept the sheep, Cain has tilled the ground. In the course of time, we're told Cain decides to make an offering of the fruit of the ground to God. We don't know why Cain made that decision. And we're not told what might have happened because, this is the first family. We're not told what might have happened that inspired Cain to think, I should make an offering to the Lord for the gifts that I am able to produce from this ground. But Cain gives the Lord an offering of the fruit from the ground. Abel brings one of the firstlings of his flock, we're told. And then we see something rather curious. The Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, the Lord had no regard. And that should make us ask some questions, right? We should be curious about why it is that the Lord's response is that response. Because obviously the Lord is not required to respond to us equitably. That is a requirement that we would want to have of God. But that might not be a requirement that God has placed on God's self to respond to us in that kind of equitable way. And what should be happening here, what we hope would happen here, is a spirit of cooperation between these brothers. So they might have come together to make their offering. If there's going to be an offering, Cain might have said to Abel, I'm kind of feeling like I'd like to make an offering to the Lord. How about you? Let's go in together and make our offering to the Lord together. And that also is not what happens. So Cain becomes angry, his countenance falls, and the Lord says to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, key words that follow here, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. And I don't think I mentioned this is New Revised Standard. So if you were wondering what version, what translation I'm using, that's what I'm using. So I want to talk about that whole notion of its desire is for you. I'm reminded as I encounter that text of a Jesus who many, many years later is going to be tempted by Satan. Satan's going to offer Jesus all kinds of things. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. That sense that even when great temptation comes our way, there's an expectation for us to be able to resist that temptation, to push away from that temptation. You can ask questions in the chat if you want to ask questions or respond to this, if you want to respond to it. But have we in fact been endowed with such incredible gifts from God that God feels that we are empowered with the ability to turn away from tremendous temptation, to be jealous or to be angry or to allow our jealousy and anger to consume us? Are we in fact endowed with so many gifts that God believes we can master the desire that is coming for us, and we're equipped to do that, and God believes that we can and should do that. Again, this a lot of trust in this humankind that God has made, a lot of understanding of us that we have such tremendous gifts that, yep, you can. Its desire is for you, but you certainly have the ability to master it. So now we're going to go on to this last slide, because we're going to spend some time on this last slide. We've seen anger and probably some jealousy and hurt and disappointment, all of those things, all of those human emotions. We've seen that. And Cain now says to his brother Abel, after God has warned him that he needs to master this sin that is lurking and waiting for him, let's go out in the field. And while they're in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So now we're experiencing the first murder in our scriptures. And there's so much to unpack about this killing, and whether Cain really does believe that he can hide this killing from his creator. Because when the Lord says to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" he says, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the Lord asks him, "What have you done?" "Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground." A lot to ponder about that text, but a lot to remind us about the fact that we are all God's, and if we choose to harm, to take a life, that person that we choose to harm is one who is loved by God and one whose voice is crying out in that harm. God is not unaware of our decisions to harm one another. God is not unaffected by our decisions to harm one another. God's quite aware, and God is hearing that crying out from the ground, and responds to Cain by telling him that now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. And there are going to be consequences. in the way that we think. Those of us who have raised children think about, trying to navigate consequences with offspring, to say, well, if you make a choice to do X, then I am going to, as your parent, respond to that by Y. I'm going to respond to that. You always have a choice, but know going into it that if you make this choice, there's going to be consequences. So now we get the consequences that God is sharing with Cain. I've heard your brother's cries. I know what has happened. You are not walking away from this without there being a consequence. The ground is no longer going to yield to you what it would have yielded to you before. You're going to be a fugitive and a wanderer. You had some safety, and now you're going to be a fugitive and wanderer. And Cain says, this is more than I can bear. Like I was not counting on this. This is more than I can handle. You've driven me away from the soil, and I will be hidden from your face. I'll be a fugitive, and anyone who meets me may kill me. God is not unconcerned, obviously, with what happens to Cain, because he says, no, whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance, meaning the only one who deals with you is me. This is God, speaking to Cain. I deal with you. If someone else chooses to wreak havoc and harm you, then they're going to suffer from me as well. So I think this is a really important thing for us to understand in this discussion about humankind, that our Creator is so loving, so concerned with what happens to us. We can bring about consequences, but yes, I see this question, who is out there? See, we don't get to know that. We don't get to know who these other humans are, because we do find out that Cain marries and has children. We don't know where Cain's wife came from. Like, the other human beings have inhabited the earth, and we didn't get the story about where the other human beings came from. Because there are other human beings by this point. There's other folks wandering around, and we don't get to find out how God chose to plant those other human beings somewhere around. That's an excellent question, and thank you for that question. But yeah, we don't get that information. We aren't told how those other human beings got planted in the places where they were planted and became part of this human story. But we are told that the Lord puts a mark on Cain so that Cain would not be harmed. Now, I think this is significant, at least it is for me, that God's love for Cain, even though Cain had done something that we would hope that Cain wouldn't want to do. This obviously is his blood sibling, but even if this were not from his own household, we would hope that we would not want to respond to other humankind who are made in this image and likeness of God. We would hope that we would not want to respond to one another by taking each other's lives. And yet, this is exactly what Cain has done. But notice God's response. I'm putting a mark on you so that no one else who comes upon you will kill you, because you're still important to me. Even though you have chosen this path, you are still important enough to me that I'm marking you so that others won't do to you what you have done to your brother. That's significant to me. That says so much about the nature of a loving God who, although there are consequences, isn't taking Cain's life, not taking Cain's life. And so often when we hear folks making arguments against the death penalty, we'll hear folks come back to this text to say, but God had an opportunity when Cain killed Abel to say, yep, death to you. Whatever happens to you just happens to you. And that's not even how God chose to respond to the first killing in Scripture. That's not how God chooses to respond to it. God chooses to respond to it by saying, I love you enough that I don't want someone to come and kill you. You're still valuable to me as my created being, and I don't want someone to kill you. But this last verse that we have here is one that is, I guess, in some ways defining, because it says that Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. And I know that we often speak of sin as the thing that separates us from God, that we kind of choose a path that separates us from God. And when we choose that path, the consequence to us is that we have taken ourselves away from the presence of God. And that's hard to hear. That it's hard to hear, and it's hard to imagine ourselves ever being away from the presence of the Lord. And yet we hear in Psalm 139, because talk about how it is that humans understand a relationship with God and closeness with God. In Psalm 139, we're told there's nowhere we can go to get away from God. If we climb to the highest heights or we fall to the depths of Sheol, there is nowhere we can go that takes us away from the presence of God. So it's really interesting to see how these scriptures offer us some thoughts about what it means to be in the presence of God and to separate ourselves from the presence of God by choices that we make. Because when we harm others, and obviously this is a big, broad kind of harm. I mean, this is taking a life kind of harm, that directly taking a life kind of harm. But we can harm one another indirectly, in ways that cost the lives of neighbors around us. There are lots of choices that we can make. Because if we see people who are literally starving because they're in places where there's still famines to this day. Scriptures talk about lots of places where there have been famines and folks have moved around to escape famine. This is Abraham's entire family is going to be spared, and we're going to come to that in as part of this Bible study. We're going to come to Abraham's entire remaining family being faced with a famine and being spared because they go into another land. They go into Egypt. And that's how they are spared from famine. So we know that there are things that happen and things to which we contribute, because our world is much more global today. And now when we see people starving, it's not, oh, they just all need to pick up. Millions of people need to pick up and wander off somewhere. Those of us who are in a position to share might be called upon to share so that others of God's people are not left without nutrition. Because I guess I look at this so differently than some people look at it. to me, when anybody in our world suffers, everybody suffers. Like if anybody is suffering, we are all suffering because some part of who we are and what we are is not thriving. This is like, oh, if I have an infection in my toe, and this is actually a real story that I know about somebody. If I have an infection in my toe and I just kind of, it's just my toe and it will be okay. But then that infection has now spread into my entire foot. And then that infection has spread into my entire leg. That infection that started out feeling like it was a minor, small thing, I'm not really all that worried about my toe. My toe will be fine. Oh, but now I'm worried because what seemed like a little thing has become a very large thing. And when any part of the body is sick, then the whole body is sick. We talk about diseases that happen in other countries almost as if we are in isolation from one another. And we're not that isolated from one another. So if malaria, for example, became a real thing multiple continents away, we're not so isolated from one another that that won't be a real thing for people in another continent. Because we're global and we travel and things happen. We're not that isolated from one another. So it's important, I think, for us to realize that the things that affect any of us kind of affect us all. And we need to be extraordinarily mindful of kind of turning our heads from those things and thinking, oh, well, that's not about me, because it may not be about us today, but tomorrow it may be about us. I'm remembering at the very beginning of COVID, that there was a lot of conversation about some Chinese workers who were in Italy in the fashion industry. And they had gone home for the holidays and had come back. And there was a realization that there was sickness, and sickness was being spread because people were traveling. People were just going from one place to another. And as they went from one place to another, they were taking sickness with them, because that's just what happens if we're sick. So remembering that the body is more related and more connected than we might want to think that the body is, yeah, that's just a true statement. That's just true for who we are and what we are as human beings. So we've had a chance to see that God created a world with this first creation story that was intended to be compatible in every way with life for these first human beings, and they're introduced into that world as the last creation of that world, to care for it and to make certain that they have everything that they need to thrive. But there's disobedience. There's immediate disobedience from Adam and Eve. And then before we can even really get going in the Genesis story, we've already had a first killing. So we know that there are things, sins, that, and we'll use that word, that truly separate us from God by our choosing. And the question for us becomes, how do we, in the words of Genesis, how do we not give in to the temptation that is lurking, that is waiting for us? How do we not give in to that? So that we continue to walk in God paths and live in this amazing, beautiful kingdom that God has created for us. So we are right at about 10 more minutes. So this is probably a good time to check the chat and to see what other questions we have. Let's see. So I think we answered Mary's question. Are there other? Oh, yes. Is there any speculation on what the mark of Cain is? I don't have any speculation on that. I think some theologians think that there was probably some mark on his face of some sort that immediately would have identified him as someone not to touch. But I don't know that we have any idea of what that was. Yeah. I wonder what the cry of the blood from the ground sounds like. Wow. Screams. Um, I mean, I think we imagine today when we hear about killings that are particularly violent, and we hear about the screams that take place when those killings come. Um, yeah, to me, that's what that is. The cries from the ground are screams, screams for mercy, screams for someone to have mercy. Yeah. And you're right. Yes, no man is an island. No man is an island. Our lives are all completely and totally dependent on one another. And I think we forget that. I do think that we forget, and we become kind of isolationist and think we don't have need of one another. But the fact of the matter is, we all have need for one another, because all of our sovereignties have brilliant minds that are inventing and creating all the time. Certainly every medical procedure, every vaccine, everything that has happened has not happened because of any one sovereignty. It's happened because God has placed a whole lot of gifts in a whole lot of places on earth, and everybody has contributed to a bank of knowledge that has helped everyone. So yeah, no man's an island. We are all very, very much dependent on one another. And I don't know about any of you. I don't raise any of my own food. The grocery store is where I get my food. I don't raise any food at my place. So I'm very dependent upon farmers, who raise food that I'm able to consume and live. We're very interdependent. I'm wondering if death is the worst punishment or consequence here that Cain feared, or the challenge and lesson is having to live with his sin and see the possibility of moving forward from it. And that's another excellent question. And thank you for that, Ezgi. There are folks who think that death is, in fact, in terms of us thinking about death penalties now, that death is actually not the worst consequence, that the worst consequence is having to live with the knowledge that we have done something that our own moral compass, our God, would tell us that we should not have done, and having to live with that, having to know that there's a family perhaps out there that has lost a loved one because of decisions that we've made. That's worse, far worse, to have to live with that knowledge than to just be gone. To live with the knowledge of how we may have harmed multiple other people who have to continue on without without a loved one, or without something that has happened to them. I'm thinking of that grocery store shooting in Buffalo several years ago, where someone just literally walked in a grocery store and killed like 10 people in a grocery store. And among the people who were killed was a dad who was going to pick up a birthday cake for his child, and lost his life in that grocery store that day. And how a family is affected by that person's decision. And if you have to live with that that's a lot for you to have to continue. I wonder if those voices don't just cry out to God. I wonder if those voices might also be crying out to those who have committed those acts. So, do you think the references to fruit of the earth that we are to eat, but not the creatures? Yeah, I think there's an argument for that, and certainly you'll see some ecology-minded theologians who suggest that it was never really intended for us to consume. Although we talk about domination of those animals, it was never really intended for us to consume them in the ways that we've kind of chosen to consume them. I have never been part of raising chickens, for example, in a that go to a place to be processed, or other kinds of livestock that go to places to be processed. I had a client long ago in my secular life, many, many moons ago, that had a livestock processing operation, and it was one of the most horrifying. I think I didn't eat meat after having gone to that processing place. I think I didn't eat meat for a few weeks because, it was not a pleasant thing. So. What are the most significant lessons we learn from these texts that are necessary for our salvation? I think already, even though we haven't been given those commandments, Moses has not been up the mountain and we don't have tablets, but I think we've learned how we separate ourselves from God early in the book of Genesis. The choices that we make that harm neighbor are the choices that separate us from the love of God, by our own doing, not because God ceases to love us. We see that God did not cease to love Cain. We separate ourselves and we think that we are no longer loved and valued in the way that God loves and values us. So we tend to separate ourselves. And I think that's necessary for our salvation, is to know that God does not intend for us to harm one another. God intends for us to respond respectfully and caringly for one another and not to harm one another. And when we make those choices, we choose kind of necessarily to do things that separate us from God. And so I think we see that early in Genesis, and we have to reckon with what does it mean to see one another as God sees us, as God's creation and valued and loved. We see some gathering of God's gifts of creation in a hoarding fashion that hurts others who do not have the ability to gather and hold. We harm in so many ways, including the dumping of poison in the creation. The earth seems to be crying out. Yes. I was having this conversation with somebody just yesterday. We were talking about incidences of cancers and other things that happen to us, because this is now the communal us. When we make choices to pollute the air, when we make choices to pollute the water, when we make choices to harm the world that God gave us that was clean when God gave it to us, when we make those choices, then we hurt ourselves and we hurt others. It's really it's not a simple thing for us to make those kinds of decisions. It's a harmful thing for us to make those decisions and not to be thinking. There's a line in the litany from yesterday about our care of creation and caring for those who come after us. If you go back and look at your Ash Wednesday prayers, there's a line about caring for those who come behind us. And that speaks to us about what it means to not disregard the world that we live in, not to dump things. And we know, I mean, years ago, I was growing up in Alabama and a bunch of plants moved in kind of not far from my great grandfather's homestead property. And you could see the smoke billowing from those plants from miles away. From miles away, you could see how the air was being polluted. So And we suffer those consequences as a communal we suffer those consequences. Um, do you think that there is a reason the story of the creation of other people was omitted? And this is from August. I don't know. I don't know. There certainly are other people, because we figure out pretty quickly that other people are walking around and other people are part of this world, but we don't know how they got there. We don't know how they got there. I mean, we do know how they got there. God created them, but like exactly where they were and exactly the pattern for which God chose to create and place them in certain places. No, we don't know how that all happens. And as time passes, we're going to find people in lots of places, interacting in lots of ways. So yeah, all good questions. All good questions.
Bishop
So
Dorothy? Bishop Dorothy?
yeah, it's 5 o'clock.
It's 5. Hey, could you give us a review for next week?
No. Do we move into Abraham? I feel like we're moving into Abraham next week.
It's Jacob.
Yes, well, that's Abraham's family.
Yes, right.
So yes, we will be moving into all the things about Abraham's family. I was preaching a couple weeks ago and talking about the fact that we've got to stop hiding out from dysfunction, because we have to be able to talk about all of the dysfunction that exists in Abraham's family, because there's a lot of hurt in Abraham's family, a lot of every generation in Abraham's family that we get to see in Genesis. There's a lot of intentional hurt and pain, and we get to see that firsthand. So we'll start talking about some of that dysfunction and hurt and pain, other ways that we hurt one another. The schedule for the reading I thought was on the email.
It is. It is.
Okay. So we'll make sure that everybody can find that again, but there is a schedule for the reading that's ahead as we start talking about Abraham's family and all the things that we need to talk about Abraham's family. Thank you all. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being here, and I'll look forward to seeing y'all next week. Take care.
Thank you.